one of the biggest names in any Dynasty draft if you're playing Superflex. I'll preface this, Jack. I really like this player. So if you're going to come on here and slate him, I'm going to be slightly upset. So we are, of course, talking about Drake Maye, quarterback out of UNC. He's 6'4", 230 pounds. What is it about Drake Maye that you wanted to talk about, Jack?
So you'll be relieved to know I do like him.
Good.
I like him a lot. Whether or not he ends up as my QB1 is TBD. I feel like every day I'm kind of flipping him and Caleb. I think he presents a lot of the traits that you look for in an NFL quarterback. I know that there's been the comparisons to Justin Herbert. I can see why. I think, first things first, he's got the size, he's got the arm, but he's also, I think, a strong processor. UNC's offense isn't necessarily the most complicated, but they switched offensive coordinators this year. I think he showed enough that he could kind of execute those full field reads, get through his progressions, knows when to check it down. He works really well between the numbers as well, which I think a lot of college quarterbacks struggle in that part of the field. And then when they get to the NFL, that's the tricky adjustment. I've got no issues with Maye on that front. He's an underrated runner as well. I don't know. I don't know where I'd rank him if we were just looking at runners in this class from this QB group, but he's pretty high.
Yeah, I think the thing that I keep pushing back against people is everybody says, well, he's not a runner, and I think that people try to almost caveat quarterback running as one thing. To me, there's different types of runners, and I tried to break this down. I put out a tweet out on Twitter a little while ago. The difference between like Caleb Williams, for example, and Drake Maye, they had similar rushing attempts, but nearly all of Caleb Williams' rushing attempts came on quarterback designed runs, whereas nearly all of Drake Maye's rushing attempts came on scrambles. And I think that that's a difference in that Drake Maye is not a player that you're going to build your running game around. He's probably not a quarterback that you're going to run a lot of, read option and QB power and stuff like that. But he is absolutely a guy of, you mentioned, he's very good at getting through his reads. If that's not open, he can tuck it and take off. And I think that I don't want to make this comparison because I think it gets thrown out. It's ridiculous. But Patrick Mahomes, that's where he's fantastic in that you think of those third and medium, third and long situations where basically teams can't play man against him, because if you play man against Patrick Mahomes, he's rushing for a first down. And and that's the kind of world that Drake Maye is as a scrambler. I don't think he's a player that's going to, rush 100 times in a year, and he's not going to have those design runs. But he is a good athlete. He is mobile, and I think he can add for fantasy potentially 200-300 rushing yards, maybe 5-6 touchdowns, which is in that kind of Dak Prescott, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert tier of, they're not a Konami code quarterback, but they do add that little bit.
Yeah, he's got that. I was watching, I think it was the Virginia game recently, and I think they're using him on zone reads. No, it was the Duke game. It was against Duke. They used him on zone reads in the red zone, and you're not going to use him. He's not like the guy who's going to get 50 yards in the open field, but he's got the size, and you can see why you'd use him in the red zone, either on QB sneaks or zone reads. But like you say, he's not a guy you're building your rushing game around. I think he's an interesting one. I think there's definitely some concerns. I mean, he's not the perfect prospect. Nobody is. I think and this is where him and Caleb are similar. They both just have that hero ball tendency, which, I mean, you don't want to knock it out of a guy. You don't want a guy to be too conservative, but sometimes you're watching it and I know there's been a lot of talk recently about Maye's decision-making, and I know certainly on Twitter, people kind of now saying he's below Jaden Daniels, or even I think Lance Zierlein has him QB3. Maybe I'm just a Maye truther, so I'm finding excuses. but it feels like he doesn't make many bad decisions. But when he does make them, they are really bad. I think
Yeah.
he had like a 1.9% turnover-worthy play rate, which was like half of what Caleb Williams had. But like, if you find those plays, they are the kind of ones that just make you scream at your TV. So I think that's the thing. He just does some very stupid things, but very rarely.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it on the screen now. If you look at those last three columns, A dot last 2 years, both over 10, big time throws, 8.4% in 2022, 7.5% in 2023. I mean, those are massive numbers. And the turnover worthy play percentage, 2.4 in 2022, 1.9 in 2023. Like, that's really impressive. And yes, he is a risk taker. He is a quarterback that's, if it's a 40-60 ball in favor of the defense, he still backs himself to try and squeeze it in there sometimes, and it does get him in trouble. But I think I'd rather a quarterback that was willing to push the ball downfield and take those chances than somebody who would sit in the pocket and have to see it open before they throw it as such. I guess the big knock that I keep hearing is the last two games of the season. There was the Clemson game, the North Carolina State game. He didn't play very well. UNC lost both games. I mean, have you got any concerns finishing his college career that poorly, and how that could impact him as a prospect?
It's a tough one, isn't it? Because I think he did have moments last year where it just didn't click. I think, and again, I'm worried this sounding like I'm making excuses, but I think it's a fair point that the surrounding talent that he had at UNC wasn't as good as a lot of the other quarterbacks we're talking about in this class. Um, I know people talk about Devontae Walker, and there's a really good running back in Amarian Hampton who's going to be coming out next year. But that offensive line was poor. There's not really much separation with his receivers. I don't want to put too much of those results on Maye, but I think it's certainly a part of the evaluation. Like, you can't ignore, certainly against a team like Clemson, right? That's the tape you switch on, right? When you're finding a prospect, you look at the defense that they played, and you'd see Clemson, you're like, right, that's the game I'm going to watch. So it's a bit of a worry. But then with the Herbert comp that keeps getting thrown out, like, I remember some of those Herbert games from his time at Oregon. The way we kind of overthought those. So I don't want to do the same thing with Maye.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that we also need to remember is that everybody says, oh, he had a phenomenal 2022. He regressed in 2023. He is also a 21-year-old player that, he's had 3 years in college, but really only had 2 seasons starting. We're comparing him with Jaden Daniels, who, if he'd have come out after his third year, I don't think he'd have probably gone until day 3. I think you've then got Michael Penix and Bo Nix, who are both 6 years in college. Like, he is very young. He is very inexperienced. And yes, there's an element of risk there. But I think for me, that's exciting because I think he's still got room to go. And I look at him and say, okay, I think his footwork needs to be cleaned up slightly. I think particularly when he gets out of the pocket and that sort of creation mode, his arm and his footwork doesn't kind of marry up, and at times he doesn't set his base and he tries to throw just purely with his arm, and it can lead to some inaccuracies. That can be worked on, that can be kind of tidied up, but the level of the size, the arm strength, the processing ability, those are pretty rare. And I think that for me, providing he goes to an interesting situation where he's, is going to have a creative play caller that's going to build things around him correctly, and he's not just going to get thrown to the wolves. I'm so excited about what he could be as a prospect, but specifically for fantasy, because small amount of rushing ability to push the ball down the field and kind of take those chances. That's where points are scored, and I think he could be really good for fantasy moving forward.
Yeah, I think he reminds me. The one thing I would say is he reminds me of, or the discourse around Maye reminds me of CJ Stroud last year. They're different players, but if you cast your mind back to this time last year, there was all the overthinking it with Stroud and the S2 test and everything else, and kind of, can an Ohio State quarterback win it in the NFL?
Well, this is it. The lazy helmet scouting drives me mad, because I've heard Drake Maye comped to Mitch Trubisky and said, well,
Yeah.
Mitch Trubisky was a failure. Can Drake Maye? Mitch Trubisky has got nothing to do with Drake Maye. They couldn't be more different.
Yeah, I've even heard someone comp him to Sam Howell. I'm like, what are we watching here, guys?
It's just lazy. It's just lazy.